Crystal Wilkinson is the award-winning author of The Birds of Opulence, winner of the 2016 Ernest J. Gaines Prize for Literary Excellence, Water Street and Blackberries, nominated for both the Orange Prize and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award. She has received recognition from the Kentucky Foundation for Women, the Kentucky Arts Council, the Mary Anderson Center for the Arts, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, and is a recipient of the Chaffin Award for Appalachian Literature. She has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and her short stories, poems, and essays have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, including most recently in the Oxford American and Southern Cultures. Her most recent novel, a lyrical exploration of love and loss, The Birds of Opulence, centers on several generations of women in a bucolic Southern Black township as they live with and sometimes surrender to madness. Her collection, Perfect Black, was published August 2021. Crystal identifies as a Southern feminist fiction writer and grew up in the hills of Kentucky. She currently teaches at the University of Kentucky, where she is Associate Professor of English in the MFA Creative Writing Program. She is a 2020 USA Artist Fellowship recipient and makes her home in Lexington, Kentucky. In 2021, Crystal was named the Poet Laureate for Kentucky. And I'm just gonna say a few words too. I'm so thankful to have Crystal as our Poet Laureate, but too as a mentor and model of the kind of poet I want to grow up to be. Crystal is an incredible teacher whose warmth and generosity come through in her presence and her care with students' work. She is the kind of teacher who sees you, who gives you permission or bravery or whatever key you need to unlock that poem or story. I haven't even mentioned her work yet, which clearly speaks for itself. Crystal can transport you to a time and place. She can conjure an image as sharp as a blade. She can write a voice that rings in your ears for days with its music. Crystal is also a mom and a grandmom, a partner, a podcast host, a friend who is always celebrating and lifting up the work of others, and definitely always a Kentuckian. We are so lucky to have Crystal Wilkinson as our keynote speaker for this year's conference. Please welcome her.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny, for that lovely introduction. I'm glad she didn't put dates to all of that. I've known her a really long time. I think I've known Danny since she was in high school. We'll whisper that. Thank you all for being here, those of you all that are here in Lexington in the audience, and thank you all that are here virtually. Before I get started reading, I just wanted to say how grateful I am to be a part of the writing community in Kentucky. You know, as I've been Poet Laureate and as I've traveled both across Kentucky and especially outside of the state, even though I already appreciated our wonderful, generous, kind, reciprocal community of writers, I appreciate it even more. And so people are always asking me, how do you all do that? There's so many writers in Kentucky and so many poets. So I wanted to express that. And I think above all, sometimes even above the talent, I think it is so important that we have community here. And the Kentucky State Poetry Society is certainly a part of building that camaraderie among writers and keeping us all going. And I think so many of the writers in Kentucky do the each one teach one model, and we are all mentoring in some way. And I'm grateful to have been mentored by so many writers in Kentucky. So I think I want to read a little bit from Perfect Black, and I wanted to read poems that are not necessarily comfortable on my tongue. I think when you do a lot of readings, you just sort of read the ones that sort of fit well in your mouth because you've read them so many times. So I want to read some of those, but also read some that I never read aloud. A big part of this book, Perfect Black, is about storytelling. And I think that at this place in my career, one of the things that has advanced my career the most, or advanced my writing, I think, is that I no longer sort of have all my writing selves in these different compartments. I used to just have them all boxed up, and then I would access the poet. I was like, okay, come on, girl, I need you, the poet, come down and let me have your muse. And then my journalistic self or my nonfiction self lived somewhere else, and I would say, hey, I need you, come out. And the same with my fiction self. And I think with the writing, not the publication of it, with the writing of Birds of Opulence, I allowed all of my writing selves to live in the same body, in the same mind, and the same heart, in the same spirit. So the poet, the nonfiction writer, and the fiction writer are always present in everything that I do. So I also believe that poetry is most related. I think they're sisters, not even cousins, but that poetry and short story are sisters. And I use that sisterhood quite a bit in this book, and I'll read a few of those pieces that are narrative. So let me just get started. Terrain. The map of me can't be all hills and mountains, even though I've been country all my life. The twang in my voice has moved downhill to the flat land a time or two. My taste buds have exiled themselves from fried green tomatoes and rhubarb for goat milk and pine nuts. Still, I return to old ground time and again, a homing blackbird destined to return. I am plain brown bag, oak and twig, mud pies and gut-wrenching gospel in the throats of old tobacco brown men. When my spine crooks even further toward my mother, I will continue to crave the bulbous tang of wild shallots, the familiar game of oxtails and kraut boiling in a cast iron pot. I toe dive in all the rivers, seeking the whole of me, scout virtual African terrain, sifting through ancestral memories, but still I'm called back home through hymns sung by stout Black women in large hats and flowered dresses. You have to risk the briar bush to reach the sweet dark fruit, and ain't no country woman all church in Piney Woods. There is pluck and cayenne pepper. There is juke joint gyrations in the young and bearing girth of this belly and these supple hips. All roads lead me back across the waters of blood and breast milk, from ocean to river, to the lake, to the creek, to branch and stream, back to the sweet rain, to the cold water in the glass I drink, when I thirst to know where I belong. So as Danny said, I am just about as Kentuckian as one can get, and sort of consider it my mission, if I have one, is to say loud and proud that there are Black folks in the hills. And I can't sing, but I've been reading this poem a lot lately, and I have to sing with it. So cover your ears if you must. Baptism. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Imagine a girl, not yet troubled, dressed in a crisp white dress, black patent leather shoes and new white tights, pressed hair smelling of royal crown, bangs curled under, glistening. He was the preacher, the Reverend William H. Mills Jr., long, good hair, slicked back, pearl-handled cane, pocket watch chain dangling from a double-breasted suit. We stand in water up to our knees. The congregation reads scripture, eyes peeking up between hymnals and Sunday hats. The Bible is handed to the deacon. I baptize you in the name of the Son, the Father, and the Holy Ghost. See me submerged in cold creek water that seeps into my nostrils, tastes like danger in my mouth. I fight the hand of the preacher, come up gasping and crying, bless her heart, she's feeling the Spirit, Sister Usher says under a heavenly hat. Everybody claps and commences to sing of being washed in the blood of the Lamb. But I didn't feel devotion, felt wicked with my secrets, wasn't even sure what the Holy Ghost was. See me with my legs closed and my skirt tail down. See me cover my knees. See me bless my food, and comfort was found in baptismal rewards. A bottle of orange knee-high, a sanctified fried chicken leg, corn pudding and German chocolate cake. Let the church say, amen. My full belly, the most sacred part. So in addition to this book being sort of a paying homage to Kentucky, paying homage to Black girlhood in Kentucky, Black Appalachian girlhood, Black fat Appalachian girlhood. I also speak some unspeakables in this book. So there are some poems that are about childhood sexual abuse, about sexual abuse in the church. And there are several poems that run through the book that are about my mother. My mother was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic when, well, 2 years before I was born. She had what was known in my family as the nervous breakdown. And then after I was born, she had another nervous breakdown. But mental illness was one of the silences that sort of swam around and throughout my family. So this is a poem about that, and it's so far been the most anthologized poem in the book. It was Ada Limon featured it on her Slow Down podcast, and it's been anthologized some other places. So if you are from rural Kentucky, or you grew up in rural Kentucky, you've probably had this experience. One of my most memorable, and not necessarily in a good way, I think that's why I became a vegetarian, was that there was always something dead in our kitchen. If you grow up on a farm, of course. But I was the kind of child that named all the animals. So every day, just about, when I came home from school, there would be, you know, Henny Penny and Frida and whatever I had named these animals, sort of there they were. And often when I would come home, there would be a hog's head in a galvanized tub in the middle of the kitchen, you know, with its tongue hanging out and the whole bit. And my grandmother would make souse. So in this poem is my mother's absence and the silence of that absence and the death of the hog. Asking about my mother. In the small kitchen, the hog's head weaves the gamey scent of death throughout the house. My grandmother scrapes black hair from the hog's pink head with the sharp blade of her butcher knife. I ask her about my mother. I always ask her about my mother. I play paper dolls under a formica table with pearls around my neck and pink lipstick from my mother's treasure chest. My grandmother places the head into the tub, and I watch her hands, wait for her to tell me where my mother's gone. My grandmother fills the tub with water. I hate that she always reminds me of all she's done for love. Remember, remember, hair, face, knife. She lifts the heavy tub and situates the hog upon the stove, covering all the burners, and turns on all the eyes. And I'll read one poem about my grandfather. This book is divided up into 3 parts, and the first part is sort of the girlhood part of the book, and the second part is sort of a coming of age, coming of political consciousness, and the third part is grown but woman poems. And I will read one of there's a suite of poems, the Water Witch poems, that are about my grandfather. And I'll read one of those. And it's sort of in his voice. So you'll hear my voice change a little bit. And maybe you all know. Do you all know what a water witch is? See a few heads nodding. So a water witch is the same as a dowser. So the water witch would be someone who was called upon to go to a certain property. My grandfather was paid for this, and they would say, we need a cistern or we need a well. And he would go and he'd take the branch off the tree and he would walk the land and it would point down and he would say, dig here. Here's where you'll find your water. And so these are from the Water Witch suite. This is the Water Witch on reading. Oh, I cipher pretty good, and can't no white man cheat me on my crops or on my change at the feed store. I'm known around these parts for being able to remove a wart with a bean. I'm the one they come to when they want their well witched, and now everybody asks me how many snows we're gonna have come winter, or when they need to pull a baby from a mama's teat. Man from way off stopped here once for me to teach him how to make sorghum. Been learning all my life. I can read a map, can read a man's eyes and see if he's truthful. I can level a girder by sight. I can read the tremble in a cow's gut, a man's footprints in the mud. I can read a man's heart to see if he's right with the Lord, though it ain't my place to say. I can read time by my own shadow. I can read the corners of Christine's mouth and tell if she's mad at me. Only thing I can't read is words. So my grandfather, like many old time men from the hills, was a mathematician, but he could not read. He was only 3rd grade educated, but he was one of the wisest men I know. So I want to read a poem called The Creek. And this is like Exhibit A from this stylistic choice that I've made. So the creek appears in this book in couplets as a poem, and it also appears in prose in another piece toward the end of the book. And one of the things that I was trying to do is hold storytelling up to the light and sort of turn it around and look at it and imagine how stories change depending on who's telling them and how they're telling them. So I'll read this version of it, and then I'll probably close with the other version. Maybe. The Creek. I guess the other thing that I'll say about this is that, again, all 3 writers are present. So there's a story in this poem, there's a poem in this poem, and there's some creative nonfiction in this poem in very pointed ways. And maybe you can find them as I'm reading them, but the creek. The women are standing in water to their knees, their dresses wafting out like sheets on a line. This place where burdens wash away in the frantic dark and the women's dresses float like blossoms. A boy is drowning, his head turned toward home, his body facing the farmer's house where the girl he loves sleeps. She is the farmer's daughter, the girl who hit his head, the one who hoisted that rock, watched his blood ooze out. This is the way you wash your clothes in the creek. This is the way you catch catfish in deep water. This is the way you catch a fish that doesn't want to be caught. This is the way your secrets twist their necks below the surface. The women are standing in water to their knees, their dresses wafting out like sheets on a line. On the creek bank, a girl runs circles, catching the wind, and the women's dresses float like blossoms. They sing prayers for the boy's mother who stands in her kitchen and cries. The circle of women in the water whisper a prayer for the girl who tells everybody she loved the boy who died. Her mother stands in the backyard and cries. Their fathers brood in the fields, walking slow as lepers, hearts and houses loaded with grief, a lamentation for all they've lost. I almost drowned once. My grandmother's dress billowed out around her like a sail. She was my harbor, my lifeboat in our creek. My mother stood on the shore, frozen with fear, my father's name mute, his kiss spoiled fruit in her young, sweet mouth. A boy's ghost haunts the creek's edge, dark water ebbing, flowing like a deacon's robe. Does he dream of her hair, her hands? Is he sorry for what he's done? Years later, on nights soaked with teenage trouble, I'd climb out my window, walk to the creek, crying to all who'd listen. The minnows leaped in moonlight while I waited for the boy. By then, I'd been raped too, but I waited for him to surface. I wanted to ask him questions, wanted to hold court with the moon as witness. I'm here, I said. Come on. They say he was handsome, but the boy never showed himself unless, of course, he was there all along, in the trees, the wind, in the shadows, in the calling of a far-off bird. At night, the creek did scare me, its rush like a boy's whispered threat in a girl's ear. But I didn't flinch, determined to stay, practice. The women are always standing with water to their knees, their dresses billowing out like sheets on a line, standing guard. There was always something roaring in those trees, teeth gnashing, fathers killing boys for the sake of their daughters, eyes glistening in the dark. And I'll read a few from the middle section. So part of another part of my process and technique is to stack memories and experiences. I think all good writing is a combination of what you know, what you imagine, and what you're curious about. So I grew up fatherless for the most part. I didn't meet my father until I was 13. So I did a lot of imagining who he was. And I watched a man be killed once. I was driving close to 3rd Street stuff, where 3rd Street stuff is now, and taking my children home. And there were 2 men fighting, and one man hit the other with a 2x4. And I'll never forget the crack of his skull, of hearing that as I drove by. And I called 911, and then later found out that the man had died. So that's in here as well. That's something that haunts me still, and it's sort of buried in this poem. My father was a city. My father was a place marked with drawn lines. Black people over here, white people over there, small shotgun houses behind fences, mamas on porches with the bright haze of television pouring into the night. Someone always left for dead in his alley. When I looked at my father, I thought of that brother on 3rd Street, the sharp crack of his skull, the 2x4 swinging the last quivers of his life. Sometimes my father was wasteful, but sometimes my father was a celebration, a child's smiling face, gold tooth twinkling, enough kindness to give us respite on nights like this. August 9th, 1974. This is a poem where I give away my age. This is not a political poem. I'm just remembering how I was eating cheese, eggs, and toast when Richard Nixon resigned, how cousins gathered around the TV, cross-legged on the floor, how I wasn't studying no president, how I was studying my cousin's friend Mark, tall Mark, with the afro as big as the globe back home on Miss Rigney's desk. This is not a political poem because I was 12 and wearing lip gloss and hot pants, flowers in my hair, so many miles from my grandmother's reach that summer. This is not a political poem, but today I'm thinking about how we got here. I'm thinking about the women. I'm thinking about the woman I've become. This is not a political poem, but today I'm thinking about guns and rape culture and men who can't think beyond the power of their pricks. This is not a political poem, but I'm thinking about the swagger and the walk of a 15-year-old boy in Ohio and wondering what kind of man he became. I wonder if he had any children. I wonder if they are alive. So I will read one more from this middle section. And try to close with some love. Maybe two more from this one. This is one of the narrative pieces that I don't read very much. The bath. At 4 a.m, a stranger looked through the window, his hand on his zipper. The wife was bathing. A bird rustled in the wet leaves. The dew fell glassy and clear. The squirrel scampered in the rose bush. The stranger's sinewy calf muscles stretched. The husband awakened, black face of God, listening to crowds of loneliness gathered in the backyard. A stray cat meowed at her prey. The ground was covered with blood and feathers, floated like fresh snow. The husband turned on the porch light. The wife shivered. The bath cooled. In another room, a child slept. The husband went back to bed, cocooned in his dream, thoughts of an unlocked window clotting his brain. The dog, which was chained to the fence, barked a warning. The house became alive with sound, though the complete roar of day was still distant. Outside in the early morning dark, the stranger smiled. The dog barked again. The husband awakened. The child turned over in his sleep. The woman stepped from the tub. The dog barked again and then it yelped. The stranger reached his hand down inside his pants. The bird was dead. The cat was in the neighbor's yard. The husband was not sleeping. The wife screamed at a shadow outside. This is another stacked poem. And then I'll close with a love poem. Black body. My black body is a boulder, a stop sign, Sometimes I think my body is graceful, a song of freedom. Sometimes I think it is something that every eye casts away. I must concentrate if I want to fit into small spaces, slip into the eye of America's needle. Twice last week, I went without eating, filling up on self-loathing and discontent, only to give in to a slice of pound cake and a bowl of ice cream. To stay awake, I drink a glass of tea and watch the flawed reality of television housewives. Before bed, I stretch myself out along the couch and place my feet in my husband's lap. I can't stop thinking about the little black girl in the back of Philando Castile's car. Mommy, please stop screaming so they won't shoot at you. At 4 years old, she saw her mother's unarmed boyfriend shot, bleeding, dead on the front seat. I can keep you safe, she tells her mother. My body embarrasses the famous white woman at the writing conference as if my fat will rub off on her if she gets too close. When I'm sick, I want buttered sweet rice and a tender hand moving in circles on my back. Yesterday, I ate meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans at the Cracker Barrel in Tennessee. The white waitress called me baby doll. Once, I remember feeling the quickening of babies in my womb, 4 tiny hands pressing against my navel, 4 tiny feet pressing against my ribs. And I will close with my favorite closing poem. I almost never read the last poem in the book, but I always close with this poem. And I think because it's in honor of my husband, Ron, and this sort of meeting that never happened. One of my greatest regrets is that he is the love of my life, but he never got to meet the other loves of my life, which were my grandparents. And so this is to him sort of wishing toward that witness. I'm convinced that if you could have seen my grandmother standing in the doorway, waiting for him to come home from the fields, if you'd smelled that spectacular evening thick with sweat and felt the pulsing of the stars, if you'd borne witness to the animals' moans echoing in the holler that night, if you just could have seen the hair rise up on Granddaddy's arm like that, like offerings to God when his elbow touched hers, if you could have seen her longing dissipate just a little as he came through the door smelling like a day's work, you should have seen them close enough to breathe the same air while not even touching. He smiled at her without smiling. If you could have seen them watching me watch them, then you'd know how much I love you. If you could have heard her say, "You want some supper? We got pie." Thank you. And thank you all in the audience on Zoom for being here as well. And I will take a few questions if anybody has a question, and then I apologize to the Zoom audience that we can't take questions from you all. But if you all here in the live audience, if you have a question, I'm happy to answer. Anybody have a question? I'll repeat it. Yes.
I really am interested in what you said about the different writer selves with different genres, you know, and how they've merged in a way. But when you go to create a piece of writing, you are thinking about form as well as language. And can you say a little more about how you might make a decision about the form that a particular piece would take?
So this is Libby asking this question, one of our great writers from Berea, who shaped so many writers at Berea College for so many years and has built a lovely online and in-home community of writers for several years. So that's who asked this question. So her question for the online audience was asking about my bifurcated writer self, all of how I make the decision about form. I do think a lot about narrative strategy, but I think about it afterwards. One of the luxuries that I have given myself is the sense of play. I think so many times as writers, once we've gotten our MFAs or we take all these workshops, that we are sometimes, it's good to be serious, but I think we sometimes take ourselves too seriously. And one of the reasons why I always loved being a writer is because it took me somewhere. I could fall into my imagination, climb into my imagination, and play and create a world and play in it. So that's the first thing I do when I'm writing, which is sometimes why things take so long. Like, for instance, I have a culinary memoir that comes out with Penguin in 2023. And it took me longer than it should have to write that book because I spent a lot of times playing with the ideas, even though I knew they were supposed to be lyric essays. But I took the liberty to play first and then came back and looked at the form and made decisions about it. So that has been, I believe in self-care and writers taking care of themselves. And that I probably have been doing since 2016. So it's fairly new, but it's been life-changing for me to go back. It's to be able to enter my 10-year-old body with a sense of wonder, a sense of play, and then worry about form and all those other things that come afterwards. So that's how I do it. Yes.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I enjoyed the meeting very much. And I hate to see you go. So thank you for all the mentoring you've done with me.
Oh.
And I too was interested in your different writers coming together. And one of the things you just mentioned is that you let yourself play, but do you have to take the play out of it in order to get published, like the play in form?
Not anymore. I mean, I think not anymore. And I wish that for everyone, because I think that even though that's what I do for a living, I mean, I'm an academic. I teach writing, but I think that form is limitless now. And I say not anymore, but I think I see it happening more and more. There are more and more books being written that are being written in exciting new ways, flash fiction or flash essay or narrative poems. They're all sort of sliding together. And I see a lot of old school folks, and I'm with the old school folks, but because at least the old part, I don't know. But sometimes people go like, "What is this? How did this get published? My goodness!" And I'm over here cheering, going, "Yes, more of this." So there are more and more people publishing in their language, whatever that is, more colloquial language, more ethnic and spiritual languages, taking more chances with form. And I love that. Which doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be polished, and it doesn't, you don't have to have a crafting phase. Of course you do. You do have to have a crafting phase. But I love the idea of more people leaning into their own forms and making them the best thing that they could possibly be, which in turn makes it more manageable or more, you're more apt to get published that way. Any other questions? Maybe one or two more? Okay.
Are you gonna write another poetry book?
Yeah. Danny asked, was I gonna write another poetry collection? I want to. I mean, I think what I've been working on about my mother's mental illness may become closer to a poetry collection than it is a memoir, which is what it started out being. So I think that that's going to become something closer to poetry, even though maybe there'll be sort of lyric poems like Michael Ondaatje's Coming Through Slaughter, or I don't know, something like that. And the Water Witch poems are a collection that I've been working on. So there are more Water Witch poems, and I've been trying to, I've never really talked about this, but I've been trying to come up with what my grandmother would be. So I want the title of this book to be The Water Witch and the da-da-da-da. And so I can't think of what descriptor that would be equally as powerful or even more powerful, because I don't want it to be like the Water Witch and his wife. Like, I don't want my grandmother to be distilled in any way. So I've been I'm writing poems in her voice too, but I don't know what that equivalent is. So I've been playing with that for a number of years too. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering when you first discovered poetry and who you consider.
So he asked when I first discovered poetry and who would be formative writers for myself. I think I discovered poetry first. Is that true? Yeah, I mean, I had a wonderful high school English teacher who was young and hip. Like, we loved her, one, because she was youthful, and, you know, she had real long hair and these John Lennon glasses, and we thought she was so cool in the 70s, going into the 80s. But she also introduced us to contemporary writers. So I think Miss Sapp was the first introduction to poetry. Although even then, I was writing bad rhyming poems. When I was in high school and grade school, they were, she introduced us to a lot of poems that still rhymed. And so I was mimicking that, and I wasn't exposed to free verse probably until college. And so some of the poets that I love are Kentucky poets, or poets who have lived in Kentucky, including my dear friend Nikki Finney, and Naomi Shihab Nye is a poet that I love. Gwendolyn Brooks, Audre Lorde, Ntozake Shange, who was one of the first writers where I said, oh, what is she doing? Like, this is prose, but no, it's not. Or this is a play. Well, sort of. It's a poem. It's a, and so that was one of the first writers that I said, oh, she's doing something different. I like this. And of course, Gail Jones, who's a Kentucky writer who sort of blew my head off with her writing too. I was like, wow. And lots of others. Of course, Wendell Berry, George Ella, lots of Kentucky poets, all of the Appalachian poets who have been, we've sort of grown up together and learned how to write together. And in fact, I loved poets so much that I never thought that I would let anybody see my poems. I considered myself a fiction writer who wrote poetry on the side, and every once in a while a poem would come out to the light and be published, and then I'd cover it back up because I was always comparing myself to the poets that I loved the most. All right. Well, thank you all so much for your time, and I appreciate it so much.